You are not the apex predator in the ocean. The great white is. And here is the part most people miss. The more you fight it, the more dangerous it becomes. These animals weigh as much as a pickup truck, swim faster than you can sprint, and feel your heartbeat from 20 feet away. We are going to cover how they hunt, why they escalate when threatened, how orcas figured out how to kill them, and what is quietly driving them toward extinction. If you enjoy this, subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know. Now, eyes open. Picture this. You're floating in 60 feet of water off the coast of South Africa. The visibility is decent, maybe 30 feet in every direction. You can see the sandy bottom below and the bright surface above. And then, from somewhere behind you, something bumps your leg. Hard. You spin around. Nothing there. Just open water and the low hum of the ocean. You already know what made that contact. And here is the thing that changes everything. Your panic response just made you a target. Great white sharks do not simply attack. They assess. And the way a great white reads a situation is built around one core signal. How does this thing respond to pressure? Scientists studying attack patterns along coastlines in California, South Africa, and Australia started noticing something strange. In cases where people thrashed hard, screamed, or kicked violently after an initial contact, the follow-up behavior from the shark was almost always more aggressive. In cases where people stayed calm or moved steadily away, the shark often disengaged. The pattern kept showing up, and researchers wanted to know why. Here is what they found. Great whites are wired to treat escalating signals as escalating threats or escalating prey responses. In the wild, a seal that thrashes violently is either panicking or fighting back. Both of those responses mean something to a great white. Panic means the prey is vulnerable. Fight back means the prey is cornered. Either way, the shark system reads the signal as a reason to commit harder. The animal is not acting out of anger. It is running a program that evolution has been writing for millions of years, and that program says, pressure plus movement plus struggle equals pursue. This is not a simple reflex either. Researchers tracking great whites with underwater cameras have documented something remarkable. When a shark makes initial contact with an object or animal it has never encountered before, it does not immediately follow up. It circles, it pauses, it watches. Scientists call this the assessment phase, and it lasts anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. During that window, the shark is reading signals, speed of movement, directionality, sound frequency coming through the water, even the electrical field of the target's muscle contractions. The shark is building a profile. What feeds into the aggression escalation is what happens during that profile building window. A diver who goes rigid and slow reads very differently than a diver who bolts upward, kicking both legs hard. The fast-kicking diver is producing sound frequencies in the water that match struggling prey. The electrical signals from rapid muscle movement spike. The visual silhouette from below becomes erratic, which in great white behavior studies correlates strongly with vulnerable animals. The shark system starts stacking signals, and past a certain threshold, the commit decision locks in. A marine researcher named Samuel Gruber spent years studying this loop in various shark species. He found that the nervous system of a shark, once pushed past a certain arousal level, actually becomes harder to interrupt. Think of it like a car accelerating down a hill. At 30 miles an hour you can brake. At 70, the physics change. Once a great white has committed to an aggressive pass, external signals have a smaller and smaller window to redirect it. The takeaway that most people never hear is this: the ocean does not reward panic. Every survival guide written by actual researchers, every rescue protocol developed by lifeguard associations says the same thing. Stay vertical. Move deliberately. Hold eye contact with the animal if you can. Those behaviors produce a different read from the shark's sensors. They do not guarantee safety. Sharks are animals, and animals are unpredictable. But the signal you send in those first few seconds shapes what happens next. And what comes next in understanding this animal gets stranger, because before a great white ever closes that distance, it already knows more about you than you know about it. Most people get the size wrong, completely wrong. When researchers measure great whites in the field, the numbers that come back are usually between 11 and 15 feet for adults. That is roughly the length of a full-size pickup truck. A female, which grows larger than a male, can push past 17 feet. The largest great white ever measured with scientific rigor came in just under 20 feet and weighed close to 5,000 pounds. 5,000 pounds! That is heavier than a full-grown rhinoceros. But the raw length misses the part that actually matters. A great white is not built like a long, thin fish. It is built like a torpedo that went to the gym. The body is dense through the middle, all muscle, with almost no wasted mass. The tail fin alone can be 5 feet tall. When a great white is moving at full speed, which researchers have clocked at around 25 miles per hour in short bursts, the tail generates so much force that the animal's body barely flexes. It is a straight-line power machine. Now picture that animal coming straight up from below. That is what a seal sees in the last second of its life off the Farallon Islands in California. Great whites there have been filmed launching completely out of the water during hunts, the full body airborne, a 5,000-pound animal clearing the surface. Scientists call this behavior breaching, and it happens when the shark attacks from directly below at maximum speed. The momentum carries it into the air. Breaches have been measured covering up to 8 feet of vertical height above the waterline. The jaws are where the numbers become almost hard to believe. A great white's mouth can open wide enough to fit a fully grown person's torso inside. The bite force has been measured at around 4,000 pounds per square inch. For reference, a hyena, which is famous for crushing bone, bites at around 1,000 pounds per square inch. A great white bites at 4 times that. A single row of teeth can be 3 inches long, and the teeth are not fixed in place like yours. They sit in soft tissue and can flex slightly inward when something pushes against them. That inward flex actually helps lock onto prey. When the jaw closes, the teeth angle back toward the throat, making it mechanically difficult for anything caught between them to pull free. Here is the part that surprises most people when they hear it. The teeth are replaceable. A great white has around 300 teeth at any given time, arranged in multiple rows behind the front row. When a front tooth breaks or falls out, which happens regularly during hunts and feeding, the tooth behind it rotates forward and takes its place. Over a lifetime, a single great white can cycle through thousands of teeth. Fossil sites around the world are full of them, which is part of why scientists have such a long and detailed record of the species going back millions of years. The body also generates heat in a way almost no other fish can. Great whites are partially warm-blooded, meaning they can raise the temperature of their muscles, eyes, and brain above the surrounding water. In cold water off California, the water temperature might be 55 degrees. A great white's core muscle temperature could be running 15 degrees warmer than that. Warmer muscles contract faster. Faster muscles mean faster reaction times and faster strikes. A cold water predator running with warm water speed. That combination alone sets them apart from almost everything else in the ocean. All of this, the mass, the bite, the speed, the heat, is just the hardware. What makes great whites genuinely terrifying is the sensory system running underneath all of it. And that system is about to make your heartbeat feel very exposed. Long before a great white sees you, it hears you. Sound travels through water about 4.5 times faster than it does through air. To a great white, the ocean is not dark and silent. It is full of noise. Every boat motor, every wave breaking on a reef, every fish darting away from a predator produces a pressure wave in the water, and great whites are built to read those waves with extreme precision. Running along each side of a great white's body from head to tail is a row of tiny fluid-filled canals just beneath the skin. Scientists call this the lateral line system. It works like a full-body microphone. When a pressure wave moves through the water and hits the shark's body, the fluid inside those canals shifts. Tiny hair cells inside the canals detect that shift and send a signal to the brain. The shark does not just hear the sound, It feels the direction it came from, the distance, and the pattern of the movement that created it. This matters more than most people realise. A struggling fish, a panicking swimmer, and a spinning boat propeller all produce different pressure patterns. They have different rhythms, different intensities, different directions. A great white's lateral line can distinguish between these patterns at distances that would surprise you. Researchers studying great white feeding behaviour in the wild have documented cases where sharks change direction toward a disturbance from over 300 feet away through murky water with near zero visibility before any other sense could have picked up the signal. Now, here is where it gets unsettling. Human swimmers produce a very specific pressure pattern in the water. The kick of freestyle swimming, the splash of treading water, the thrash of someone who just fell off a surfboard, all of these generate irregular low-frequency pulses. In the wild, irregular low-frequency pulses come from one main source: injured or disoriented animals, animals that cannot escape. In the sensory language of the ocean, an irregular struggling sound is a dinner bell. It is a signal millions of years old, and great whites respond to it almost automatically. A research team studying great white feeding patterns off South Africa played recorded underwater sound through a speaker submerged near a known feeding area. When they played the sound of a struggling fish, sharks responded from over 200 feet away, orienting toward the speaker within seconds. When they played a regular rhythmic swimming sound, the response rate dropped sharply. The sharks still noticed it, but they responded with far less urgency. The irregular sound was the trigger. This is why surf breaks near seal colonies are more dangerous than open ocean swimming areas. Seals are loud in the water. They dart, change direction, breach the surface, splash. A crowded surf break full of surfers paddling, falling and splashing creates a wall of sound that from a distance is hard to separate from a feeding frenzy of sea life. The shark does not know what is making the noise until it gets close enough for other senses to take over, but the sound alone is enough to start the approach, and the approach is methodical. A great white heading toward a sound source does not rush in blind. It spirals inward, circling wider than you would expect, cross-referencing the pressure signals from its lateral line with information coming in from its eyes and nose. By the time it gets close enough to see you, it already has a surprisingly complete picture of what you are and how you are moving. The last sense to come online is the one most people have never heard of, and it is the one that reads your heartbeat. Your heart produces an electrical field. Every heartbeat sends a small pulse of electricity outward through your body and into the water around you. You cannot feel it, you cannot control it, and a great white can detect it from 20 feet away. This happens through a system called the ampullae of Lorenzini. That is a long name for something that looks, up close, like tiny dark pores scattered across a great white's snout. Each pore opens into a jelly-filled canal that connects to a cluster of cells sensitive to electrical fields. A great white has hundreds of these pores covering its face, chin, and the underside of its snout. Together they form a detection grid that is among the most sensitive biological electrical sensors ever studied. The system is so precise that researchers have measured great whites responding to electrical fields weaker than 1/1000th of a volt per centimetre. To picture that, imagine a 9-volt battery, the kind in a smoke detector. Now imagine a field 1 billion times weaker than what comes out of that battery. Great whites can feel it. In water, at close range. Every living animal generates electrical fields through muscle movement and nerve activity. Fish, seals, turtles, and humans all produce them at slightly different frequencies and intensities. A great white's grid can read those differences. A fish resting still on the seafloor, buried in sand, invisible to every other predator in the area, still produces a detectable electrical signal through the sand and into the water above. Great whites have been filmed suddenly plunging their snouts into apparently empty seafloor and pulling out a flatfish that nothing else could have found. Now bring this back to humans. A person floating in the water, even motionless, has a beating heart, That heart produces a rhythmic electrical signal. A person who is frightened has a faster heartbeat, which means a faster, stronger electrical signal. A person thrashing in panic is firing muscles all over their body, which spikes the electrical output dramatically. From a great white's perspective, a panicking human is essentially flashing a bright light. Scientists believe the ampullae of Lorenzini also help great whites navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. The ocean has magnetic gradients, bands of slightly stronger or weaker magnetic force running across large areas of open water. Great whites on long migrations have been tracked moving in almost perfectly straight lines across thousands of miles of open ocean, with no landmarks, no light cues, nothing visible to orient by. The leading explanation is that they are reading the magnetic map through the same electrical sensing system they use to find prey. What is stranger still is the question of how much the two functions interact. Is a great white navigating and hunting simultaneously through the same set of sensors? Researchers suspect yes. The animal's brain processes sensory input from the ampullae in real time, constantly. Navigation and threat detection and prey detection may all be running as one single awareness in the shark's mind, with the same input serving all three purposes depending on context. Here is the part that makes researchers genuinely pause. A great white approaching a diver is getting electrical data about that diver's emotional state before it is close enough for the diver to see it. The shark knows, in a basic sensory sense, how scared you are. It knows your heart rate is climbing, and based on everything we know about how great whites interpret escalating signals, that rising heart rate is information the shark is using to decide what to do next. Before it ever bites, it bumps, and that bump is doing something specific. It usually starts with a bump. Divers, surfers, and swimmers who survive great white encounters describe the same thing with surprising consistency. A hard, sudden impact. Sometimes from behind, sometimes from the side, solid enough to knock them off a surfboard or spin them in the water, but no teeth, no wound, just force. And then the shark is gone. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it does not. That bump is not random, it is a measurement. When a great white is assessing something unfamiliar, it uses its rostrum, the hard cartilage-packed front of its snout, to make physical contact. This is called a bump and bite or investigative bump, depending on what follows. The snout is packed with sensors. The ampullae of Lorenzini we just talked about are densest at the tip of the snout, which means the moment of contact gives the shark an enormous burst of electrical and mechanical information. It reads the firmness of what it hit. It reads the electrical response. It reads whether the target moved away, stayed still, or fought back. Think of it as a handshake that delivers more information than a conversation. In about half a second of physical contact, the great white collects data that no amount of circling from a distance could give it. The bump is essentially a diagnostic test. Researchers studying attack patterns found that in encounters where an investigative bump happened before a bite, the shark's following behavior split into two main groups. When the target reacted to the bump by moving away steadily and calmly, the shark disengaged in the majority of documented cases. When the target reacted with violent thrashing, the shark followed up with a more aggressive approach in the majority of documented cases. The bump was not an attack, it was a question, and the answer the target gave determined what came next. This behavior has been documented in other shark species but is most pronounced and most consistently described in great whites. Scientists believe it evolved because great whites, unlike many other predators, carry a significant cost in attacking incorrectly. Their teeth can break, their bodies can be injured. A 2,000-pound sea lion defending itself can do real damage to a shark's face. So great whites developed a system for reducing incorrect attacks by gathering information first. The bump is the final data collection step before a decision. Here is the part that changes the picture. A great white's bump is also a dominance test. In encounters between two great whites competing over food, bumping behavior shows up frequently. The larger shark bumps the smaller one. If the smaller shark retreats, the food goes to the larger animal. If the smaller shark holds its position, the interaction can escalate. Researchers watching great white feeding dynamics at seal colonies have documented this hierarchy in action dozens of times. The bump is a universal tool, used for both investigation and social control. What this means for humans is uncomfortable to sit with. A great white approaching a person is running the same assessment it would run on any unfamiliar object in its territory. You're not immediately prey, you're an unknown quantity. The bump is the shark asking a question about what you are and whether you are worth the risk. Your response to that bump shapes the shark's next decision in real time. The ocean does not give you a second chance to change your answer. What happens inside the shark's body during this process, especially when something threatens it back, is a chemical story. And it is what makes great whites get more dangerous the harder you push them. Every animal on Earth has a stress response. You have one. A deer has one. A crow has one. When something frightening happens, a flood of stress hormones hits the bloodstream, the heart speeds up, the muscles get ready to move, and the brain shifts into a narrow, focused mode. In most animals, this state fades after the threat goes away. But in great whites, something different happens when the stress keeps building. Instead of shutting down, the system locks into high gear. And high gear in a great white means something very specific: total commitment to action. The key hormone here is cortisol. In mammals, including humans, a cortisol spike causes stress, anxiety, and in extreme cases shutdown behavior: freeze, flee, or panic. In sharks, the cortisol response is different. Studies measuring cortisol levels in stressed sharks consistently show that elevated cortisol correlates with increased movement, increased exploratory behavior, and increased aggression. The shark does not freeze, it accelerates. Researchers found this out partly by accident. A team studying shark behavior was using standard capture and tag methods, which involve restraining the shark briefly at the surface. When they measured blood cortisol in sharks immediately after capture versus sharks tagged using less stressful methods, the captured sharks showed massively higher cortisol levels. When those same captured sharks were released and their post-release behavior was monitored, they were significantly more reactive, more likely to approach objects, and more likely to respond aggressively to disturbances near them for several hours after release. This finding has real-world weight. It means a great white that has been chased, harassed, cornered, or involved in a tense encounter with a boat or diver is running hotter after that encounter than it was before. The stress does not calm it down, it winds it up. Now layer this on top of everything we already know about the shark's sensory assessment system. A great white that has been threatened starts bumping and circling with elevated cortisol flooding its system. Its response threshold drops. Things that it might have ignored at baseline, a splashing swimmer 200 feet away, the sound of a nearby boat, a diver making sudden movements, all of these now cross the threshold into action territory faster and more decisively. The animal is primed. Here is something that disturbed researchers when the data came in. Great whites near areas with heavy boat traffic, including cage diving operations and shark watching tours, showed behavioural patterns consistent with chronic mild stress. They were more reactive on average than sharks in quieter areas. The repeated exposure to boats, engines, and human proximity was not desensitizing them. It was keeping them in a low-level stress state that lowered their response threshold on an ongoing basis. The water around busy diving sites was, in a measurable way, producing edgier sharks. The cortisol loop also interacts with territorial instinct. Great whites do not hold permanent territories the way wolves do, but they do show strong site fidelity, meaning they return to the same feeding ground season after season. A shark that feels its feeding ground is being encroached on by boats, by divers, by noise, shows elevated stress hormones during those encroachments. And elevated stress hormones mean elevated aggression. Push the animal in its own kitchen, and you are pushing a machine that gets more dangerous every time you push. What the cage diving industry does to that machine is a story nobody in the business wants told. The cage looks solid. Thick steel bars, heavy bolts, a metal floor that keeps you anchored while the ocean moves around you. You descend maybe 30 feet, the visibility opens up and then you see it. A great white drifting toward the cage, enormous and unhurried, close enough to touch if you were foolish enough to reach through the bars. It is one of the most powerful wildlife experiences available to any person willing to pay for it. And scientists are increasingly worried about what it is doing to the sharks. Cage diving operations work by attracting great whites to the boat using chum, which is a slurry of blood, fish oil and fish parts poured into the water to create a scent trail. The sharks follow the trail to the source. Near the source there is a metal cage. Near the cage there are humans. The sharks associate the smell of food with the presence of humans and boats. This happens dozens of times per season, across years, at the same sites. The concern researchers have raised is not that the sharks are being harmed directly. The concern is behavioural. Classical conditioning, the same process Ivan Pavlov used with his dogs a century ago, works on great whites just as it works on every other animal with a nervous system. Pair a stimulus with a reward repeatedly, and the animal starts to expect the reward every time it encounters the stimulus. Pavlov's dogs drooled at a bell. The worry is that cage diving sharks are developing a learned association between the sight and sound of boats and humans with the smell and presence of food. A team of researchers studied great white behaviour at cage diving sites in South Africa and compared it with behaviour at non-dive sites along the same coastline. The sharks near dive sites approached boats more readily, came closer to the surface during boat presence, and spent more time near human structures than sharks in areas with no diving activity. The study could not prove that cage diving caused attacks, but it documented a measurable shift in how comfortable these sharks had become with human proximity. The deeper problem is the combination of signals. At a cage diving site, a great white is being attracted by food smells, presented with struggling human-like figures in the water, and then rewarded with additional chum. The shark is receiving a sensory package that links human presence with opportunity. And great whites, as we are learning, are better at learning and remembering than anyone expected. Some operators argue that the sharks are smart enough to distinguish the cage from a normal ocean encounter, that the steel, the boat, the structured environment register as a category separate from open water swimming. There is some evidence this is true for individual sharks at heavily trafficked sites. Researchers have identified specific great whites that visit dive boats regularly and behave with striking calmness around cages, showing none of the investigative circling they would show in the wild. But those same sharks, when tracked into open water, revert to full wild behaviour. The learned calm is site-specific, and here is the problem with that. A shark that has learned to associate boats with food safety, but only at the dive site, has still updated its internal model of what humans and boats mean. That update does not simply vanish when the shark swims elsewhere. What it does with that update in unfamiliar situations is still an open question, and it is one that coastline communities near dive sites have started asking loudly. The industry has responses, and some of them are reasonable. Regulation, baiting restrictions and distance rules have all been proposed, but the behavioural change the research documents predates most of those responses, and the idea that a great white is a simple, reactive predator that cannot update its model of the world, that idea is already dead. What replaced it is far more interesting. After a shark attack, the local response is almost always the same. Boats go out, drumlines go in, fishermen patrol the area. The goal is to catch and kill the one shark responsible. The assumption behind all of it is that somewhere out there is a specific animal that decided to attack humans. Find that shark, eliminate it, and the danger passes. For most of the 20th century, this idea had enough cultural grip that governments acted on it without question. Science has largely dismantled it. The rogue shark theory, the idea that individual great whites develop a specific taste for humans and return to hunt them, peaked in popularity after a series of attacks along the New Jersey coast in 1916. Over 12 days, 5 people were attacked in the same general area, 4 of them killed. The story spread globally and directly inspired the book and film Jaws decades later. The assumption that one shark was responsible for all 5 attacks shaped how people thought about great white danger for generations. When researchers went back and analysed the 1916 attacks with modern tools and modern knowledge of shark behaviour, the picture fell apart. The attacks occurred in a creek, an environment almost no great white would ever enter, which pointed toward bull sharks as the likely culprits for at least some of the incidents. The idea that a single animal was systematically hunting humans along a coastline did not hold up against the biology. Great whites do not have a dietary preference for humans. Humans are not nutritious enough and are too difficult to catch repeatedly to make logical prey. What actually drives clusters of attacks in one area is far less dramatic and far more logical. Prey concentration brings sharks in. Warm water brings sharks in. Dense beach use during summer brings more people into the water at the same time that sharks are feeding more actively. The overlap of those factors produces multiple incidents. Remove any one of them and the incidents drop. The shark is responding to its environment, not hunting a species. Researchers tracking great whites with satellite tags confirm this. The same animals that were present near a beach during an attack period were gone within days or weeks, following prey movements. They were not waiting around. They were living their lives across hundreds of miles of open ocean, and the beach encounter was incidental. The decision to cull sharks after an attack, which several countries have carried out, has been studied for effectiveness. The results are consistent. Culling does not reduce attack rates. Killing great whites in an area does not make that area safer, because the sharks are transient, and different animals move through constantly. Removing 1 or 2 sharks from a population that regularly passes through an area changes nothing about the risk profile. What changed in scientific thinking was the recognition that great white behaviour is dynamic and context-driven. The same animal behaves completely differently depending on prey availability, water temperature, stress levels, recent history, and location. There is no rogue. There is only an animal responding to its conditions, and understanding those conditions is the only thing that actually predicts risk. The part that makes this even more complicated is how well great whites actually remember those conditions. For most of the 20th century, sharks were written off as simple animals. Fast reflexes, strong instincts, but nothing in the brain capable of real learning. They were machines, basically. Set a stimulus, get a response, no memory, no adaptation. That picture was wrong, and the evidence that dismantled it came from some genuinely surprising experiments. One of the earliest cracks in the old idea came from a study in the 1960s, where researchers trained a nurse shark to press a target with its snout to receive a food reward. The shark learned the task within a few sessions. More surprisingly, it remembered the task 10 months later when retested, with no reinforcement in between. 10 months of memory in an animal everyone assumed had none. For great whites specifically, the evidence of learning comes from field observation, because great whites are almost impossible to study in captivity. Scientists tracking individual great whites at seal colonies in South Africa and California began noticing that the same animals returned year after year and changed their hunting strategies over time. A young great white at the Farallon Islands off the California coast would attempt attacks in broad daylight, often unsuccessfully. Older animals at the same site preferred dawn and dusk, attacked from deeper angles, and had dramatically higher success rates. The older sharks had learned. They had updated their hunting approach based on outcomes. Researchers studying feeding dynamics at South African seal colonies documented individual sharks with distinct, repeatable hunting styles. One shark consistently approached from the east during morning light, using the sun behind it to reduce visibility to its prey. Another shark hunted in shallower water than average, closer to the rocks where seals rested. These were not random variations. They were consistent individual strategies that the sharks returned to season after season. Learning, memory, individual problem solving. Even more striking was what happened when a new food source appeared near a known shark area. In the 1990s, a whale carcass drifted into an area off South Africa where tagged great whites were being monitored. Within hours, sharks appeared at the carcass. Within days, word had apparently spread through the local shark population in some way scientists still do not fully understand. New sharks arrived, including some that had never been documented in the area before. How they knew about the carcass remains an open question, but the speed and pattern of arrival suggested some form of information transfer. The most recent and most disturbing evidence of great white learning comes from tracking data following their interactions with humans. Great whites that have been tagged near fishing boats, near cage diving operations, or near areas with high beach use develop what researchers call approach habituation. They start behaving differently near human structures than sharks with no human exposure. They come closer, stay longer, and show less of the cautious circling behaviour that wild great whites normally use around unfamiliar objects. The animal is updating its mental model of the world based on experience. It is learning that certain human-associated signals are safe to approach, and that learning compounds. Each encounter that ends without harm reinforces the idea that the next approach is also worth trying. What makes this especially layered is that while the great white is learning about you, it is simultaneously watching you with far more strategic patience than most people realise. Before it ever makes a move, it has often already spent several minutes studying you from directly below. A great white hunting a seal does not rush in blind. It watches first. Off the coast of South Africa, at a group of islands called the Seal Islands near Gansbaai, researchers using underwater cameras mounted on the seafloor captured something that changed the way scientists understood great white hunting. They documented great whites holding position 30 to 50 feet below resting seals, watching them, motionless, waiting. For minutes at a time, the sharks were reading the seals the way a chess player reads a board. What they were looking for was a seal that separated from the group, a seal that moved toward open water, a seal that showed any sign of injury, disorientation, or distraction. Great whites do not waste energy on even odds. They select for disadvantaged targets with almost surgical calculation. A healthy, alert seal in a group is a difficult and dangerous target. A seal that drifts 15 feet from the others and looks the wrong direction for 2 seconds is something else entirely. The attack, when it comes, happens from directly below. A great white hunting a seal at the surface accelerates upward through the water column at maximum speed. From 30 feet down, by the time the shark reaches the surface, it is moving fast enough to breach completely, carrying the seal with it. The entire strike from initial movement to surface impact takes under 2 seconds. The seal often has no time to respond at all. Researchers studying this behaviour calculated the geometry of the attack and found something remarkable. Great whites almost always approach from the direction of the darkest water, using the depth below as visual cover. Their countershading helps. The top of a great white is dark grey or blue-grey, which blends with the dark water when seen from above. The belly is white, which blends with the bright surface when seen from below. The colour scheme is not random. It is a concealment system built into the animal's skin. Human encounters follow a similar structural logic, even if humans are almost never selected as deliberate prey. A person floating on a surfboard, viewed from 30 feet below, presents a silhouette that overlaps significantly with a resting seal. Both are roughly the same size. Both have appendages dangling into the water. Both are at the surface, still or moving slowly. The difference between the two silhouettes from that angle, in murky water with limited light, is smaller than most surfers would like to believe. But the strategic patience involved in great white hunting goes further than the surface attack. Researchers observing great whites near seal rocks documented what they call stalk behaviour, where a shark will make a single unsuccessful strike, withdraw, and then position itself for a second attempt based on where the seal moves after the first contact. The shark is tracking the seal's escape route and predicting where it will go. The second strike is positioned ahead of the target, not at it. This is anticipatory hunting. The shark is modelling the future position of its prey. That requires holding information in short-term memory, processing the trajectory of a moving target, and repositioning accordingly. For an animal dismissed as a simple reflex machine, this is remarkably structured behaviour. The ocean around a resting seal or a floating surfer is rarely as empty as it looks. Somewhere below, something may already be running the numbers, and the specific reason surfers get targeted more than swimmers goes deeper than just the silhouette. Surfers make up a disproportionate share of great white attack victims globally. The numbers are consistent across decades and across continents. In California, in South Africa, in Australia, surfers are involved in more attacks than any other group of water users. For a long time, the explanation was simple. Surfers spend more time in the water in areas where great whites hunt. But the data pointed to something more specific than just time in the water. The silhouette problem is real, and it starts with physics. A surfer lying prone on a board paddling creates a shape that from below matches a sea lion with remarkable precision. Seal researchers and shark researchers actually sat down and compared the outlines. A shortboard with a surfer paddling on it and a California sea lion swimming at the surface have nearly identical profiles when viewed from 30 feet beneath. Same size range, same general shape, same pattern of limb movement, and the movement is the key part. Paddling creates an irregular asymmetric arm motion that produces exactly the kind of low-frequency pressure pulses a great white reads as struggling or wounded prey. A competitive swimmer doing freestyle produces a faster, more regular, more symmetrical pattern. That pattern reads differently to a great white's lateral line system. The surfer's paddle, stop, paddle again. Rhythm is far closer to the erratic movement of a struggling animal. Researchers at the University of Western Australia tested this directly. They presented great white sharks with different shaped boards and different movement patterns in controlled conditions. The most consistent trigger for approach behaviour was an irregular, asymmetric movement pattern, combined with a size matching the shark's typical prey. The surfer's natural paddling motion hit both of those triggers at once. Wetsuits add another layer. Most wetsuits are black. Most seals are dark-coloured. In low-light conditions, which is when great whites hunt most actively at dawn and dusk, a black wetsuit in the water produces a thermal and visual signature that in every documented study reads closer to seal than to human. Great whites are not confused animals. They are operating on the best available information from their sensory systems, and at the moment of decision, that information points towards something familiar. Feet hanging off the edge of a board are a separate problem entirely. Great whites investigating a surfboard from below frequently bite the corner of the board or the foot hanging nearest the water first. Analysis of bite patterns on recovered surfboards shows that the corners and rails attract the most damage, which matches the areas where a seal's flippers would project from a similar silhouette. The shark is biting at what its sensory system has tagged as the most anatomically logical point of contact on a seal-shaped target. The time of day data reinforces all of this. Attacks on surfers spike dramatically in the hour after dawn and the hour before dusk. Great whites near seal colonies are most active during these windows because seals go in and out of the water at those times. The same windows are peak surfing hours at many popular beaches because the wind is calm and the waves are clean. Humans and sharks are both showing up at the same place, at the same time, for completely different reasons. Understanding why surfers get targeted leads directly to a harder question. Once a great white makes contact, why does it often back off? The bite and wait strategy is one of the most studied and least understood behaviours in the species, and the answer reveals something surprising about how the shark thinks about risk. a great white attacks, delivers one enormous bite, then pulls back and waits. This is one of the most documented and most counterintuitive behaviors in the species, and for a long time nobody could agree on what it meant. The simple explanation, the one most often repeated, is that the shark is waiting for the prey to die from blood loss so it can feed safely. A wounded sea lion is still dangerous. Its front flippers are strong enough to slash a shark's face. Its bite is powerful enough to cause injury. A great white that hangs on through the animal's final struggle risks serious damage to its eyes, gills, and sensory organs. So the strategy is to deal the wound, withdraw, and let biology do the rest. That explanation is partially right, but the behavior is more complex than a simple wait for death pause. Researchers fitting great whites with accelerometers, devices that measure every movement the shark makes, found that after a strike on a seal, the shark does not simply hover passively. It circles, it maintains a specific distance, and it responds to signals from the prey. If the seal stops moving, the shark moves in. If the seal starts moving again, the shark sometimes backs off again. The behavior is dynamic. The shark is actively monitoring the situation and adjusting. In human encounters, the bite and wait dynamic produces the survival window that has saved many lives. A great white delivers a bite, often large enough to cause catastrophic injury, then withdraws. The person in the water is left in a situation where the next 30 to 90 seconds are critical. If someone nearby can apply pressure and begin a rapid exit, the shark has often already moved far enough away that the extraction happens without a second attack. Why does the shark wait longer with humans than with seals? Researchers have a few working explanations. One is that humans fight back harder than seals during and after the bite. A person screaming, splashing, and striking back at a shark produces a sensory profile that the shark reads as dangerous. The elevated movement, the irregular electrical signals, the noise, all of these tip the shark's risk calculation toward caution. Another explanation involves caloric assessment. Sounds cold, but this is what drives the behavior at the biological level. A great white's attack decisions are shaped by energy cost versus energy reward. Seals are calorie dense and worth the risk calculation. Humans, biomechanically, are not a high reward target. More muscle than fat, less predictable movement, harder to subdue. After the initial bite, if the shark's sensory system gets a read that suggests the target is high risk and low reward, it may simply decide the encounter is not worth continuing. There is a third explanation that makes researchers the most uncomfortable. The shark may be learning in real time during the encounter. Each second of monitoring after the initial bite is another second of data collection. The shark is reading the electrical output, the movement pattern, the behavior of every other creature in the water around the target. It is building a picture, and the decision to return or withdraw is based on that picture, not on a fixed program. The mechanics of what happens during the actual bite, the way the jaw moves and the teeth engage, are stranger and more precise than most people expect. The moment a great white bites, something unusual happens with its eyes. Just before impact, a great white rolls its eyes backward into its head. This is a protective reflex. The eyes are the most vulnerable part of the animal during a bite on prey that can fight back. By rolling them back, the shark covers them with tough tissue. During the strike, the shark is essentially blind. It relies entirely on its other senses to guide the final moment of the bite. Here is how the jaw works. The great white has two independent jaws, one on the top and one on the bottom, both of which can move independently of the skull. When the shark bites, the lower jaw drops, and the upper jaw actually pushes forward and down, away from the skull. This is called jaw protrusion. It means the shark's bite extends further forward than the skull itself, dramatically increasing the reach and closure force of the bite. The bite force at the back teeth, which are broader and flatter and used for crushing, is higher than at the front teeth. But the front teeth, long and serrated, are doing a different job. They cut. As the jaw closes, The upper teeth are angled slightly backward. The lower teeth are angled slightly forward. The two rows work together like scissors, pulling in opposite directions while the jaw closes, which is what creates the slicing action on tissue. The serrations on each tooth are not random. Under magnification, they look like tiny saw blades. Each serration has its own micro edge. When a great white shakes its head during a bite, which it does in a rapid lateral motion, every micro edge on every serration is cutting simultaneously. The tissue damage from a single head shake during a bite is many times greater than the damage from the initial bite alone. Researchers studying bite mechanics found that the jaw pressure is not distributed evenly. The back of the jaw generates far more force than the front. This means a great white biting with the back of its mouth, which is what happens when it gets a deep grip on a large target, delivers a force comparable to having a small car land on the same spot. That force is enough to crush bone, penetrate steel diving tanks, and drive through the fiberglass of a surfboard. The tongue, if you can call it that, plays a role few people expect. Great whites have a structure on the floor of their mouth called the basihial, which is a flat, rigid plate made of cartilage. It does not function like a mammal tongue for tasting or moving food. It functions more like a guiding plate, helping direct large pieces of food toward the throat during swallowing. But researchers have noted that during investigative bites, the basihial does seem to be pressed against the target in a way that brings additional sensory contact, possibly giving the shark tactile feedback through the mouth floor. The result of all of this is an instrument of extraordinary precision. Despite the raw power involved, the bite is not brute force alone. It is a mechanically tuned system that cuts, samples and crushes with different components serving different purposes. After the bite, what triggers the shark to return or stay away is partly about what it tasted. And the story of blood in the water is nothing like what most people think. Every ocean thriller ever made has the same scene. A single drop of blood hits the water goes still, then fins appear on the horizon, dozens of them, converging from miles away, drawn by that single drop, arriving within seconds. It is one of the most enduring images in popular culture. It is also, in almost every detail, inaccurate. Great whites can detect blood in the water. That part is real. The concentration required to trigger a response is genuinely tiny. Researchers have measured detection thresholds in parts per million, which means a small amount of blood dissolved in an enormous volume of water still registers on a shark's olfactory system. The nose of a great white devotes about 14% of its total brain volume to smell processing, which tells you how central this sense is. But detection is only the first step, and the steps that follow are far more complicated than a straight-line sprint toward the scent. When a shark detects a blood scent in the water, it does not immediately know where the source is. The scent is carried by currents, and ocean currents are not straight lines. They bend, split, spread, and diffuse. A shark following a blood scent trail is doing something called edging, which means it swims across the current, back and forth, until it finds the direction in which the concentration is increasing. Then it turns that way and keeps edging. It is not a direct approach. It is a zigzag search pattern that can take many minutes to resolve into a clear direction. The distance at which this works in open ocean is also much shorter than movies suggest. Depending on current speed and water temperature, useful scent trails dissolve and diffuse over distances of a few hundred feet to at most a few miles in most real-world conditions. The idea of a shark responding from 10 miles away to a single drop of blood is fiction. Here is what is actually much more powerful than blood alone: fish oil. Oily compounds from fish, particularly from the internal organs and fat of injured or dead fish, trigger a stronger and faster olfactory response in great whites than mammal blood does. This is because great whites evolved primarily as fish and marine mammal hunters in specific ecosystems. The chemical signatures of their prey are the ones their olfactory system is most tuned to. Human blood, by itself, does not produce the same magnitude of response as the expected prey chemicals. Researchers testing shark responses to various substances in controlled conditions found that the sharks responded with significantly more urgency to fish-derived oils than to human blood. Human blood did trigger investigative responses, but the urgency and the approach behaviour were lower intensity than with fish-based attractants. This has a practical implication that changes the risk picture entirely. An injured surfer in the water is producing a blood signal, yes. But a surfer bleeding near a fishing boat that has been chumming with fish oil and fish parts is in a categorically different situation. The shark in that environment is already in feeding mode, already attracted by the strongest chemical triggers for its species. The human blood is an add-on to an already elevated state. The picture of blood in the water as the single trigger for great white danger is not only incomplete, it is a distraction from the actual chemical story that researchers have documented in real attack scenarios. And the sharks near seal colonies have an even more specific relationship with chemical signals that shifts their baseline behaviour in ways the open ocean never would. Two groups of great whites, same ocean, same species, completely different behaviour. Researchers comparing great white populations at seal colonies versus great whites, tracked in open water, found a consistent behavioural divide. The seal colony sharks were faster to approach unfamiliar objects, faster to engage with potential prey signals, more likely to follow up an investigative pass with a second and third approach, and measurably more reactive to disturbance. This is not about personality, it is about context. Great whites near seal colonies are in a constant state of elevated readiness. Seals are fast, agile, and difficult to catch. A single failed hunt costs energy. The sharks near seal colonies have adapted, over repeated experience at those sites, to commit faster and harder to opportunities because seals do not give second chances. An adult Cape fur seal can outmaneuver a great white in close quarters. The only way to catch one reliably is the ambush from below, and only if the shark commits at the right moment. This elevated commitment threshold bleeds into every other interaction the shark has in that environment. A great white patrolling near a seal colony is running in a different mode than a great white cruising open ocean. Its cortisol baseline is higher, its sensory attention is sharper, its response times are faster. Everything nearby is evaluated through a lens already calibrated for rapid action. Researchers measuring behaviour at the Seal Islands in South Africa and at the Farallon Islands off California have documented something they call site-specific aggression profiles. The sharks at these sites show a measurable uptick in reactive behaviour compared to baseline that persists throughout the feeding season. When dive boats enter these areas, the sharks approach them faster than sharks approach dive boats in non-colony areas. When acoustic signals resembling distress are played in the water, the colony sharks respond at lower intensity thresholds than open ocean sharks. The chemical environment at a seal colony adds another layer. Seal oil, seal blood, seal waste, and decaying seal carcasses create a persistent low-level chemical signal in the water near these sites throughout the year. Great whites that return to these sites season after season have developed what researchers describe as a chemical context. The smell of the colony means prey opportunity, it means heightened readiness, and it means that anything else producing any signal in that environment gets evaluated against a baseline of high alert. For humans entering these areas, the implications are direct. A surfer in the water near a seal colony is not just dealing with a great white in general. They are dealing with a great white that has been specifically calibrated by its environment to respond faster and more decisively than the same shark would in open water. The location itself shifts the risk calculation. The size of the shark matters too, but in a counterintuitive way. At most seal colonies, the largest and most experienced sharks dominate the best hunting positions. They have seniority, and they enforce it. Great whites were long considered solitary. The image was of a lone predator, roaming vast stretches of ocean with no meaningful relationship to other members of its species. That image does not match what researchers started documenting when they had the tools to track multiple sharks at the same time and place. At feeding sites, great whites have a clear social order, and they maintain it through behaviour, not just size. The hierarchy follows a pattern. Larger females outrank larger males. Larger animals of the same sex outrank smaller ones. But pure size is not the whole story. Residency matters. A shark that has been at a feeding site for longer, that has established familiarity with the area and with the other sharks there, holds an advantage over a larger shark arriving for the first time. Researchers observing individual great whites at South African feeding sites documented cases where a smaller resident shark held a feeding position against a larger newcomer through a combination of posture and persistence. The behavioural signals they use to communicate rank are striking. A dominant great white approaching a feeding area will swim in a specific posture, arched back, pectoral fins angled downward, mouth slightly open in what researchers call a threat gape. This posture combination is a clear signal. When another shark sees it, the response is usually immediate. The subordinate animal veers off, changes depth, or exits the area entirely. Physical confrontations between great whites over food are documented but rare. The posture system works well enough that most rank disputes are resolved without contact. What researchers found most striking was how consistent and stable these hierarchies were over time. The same animals, in the same positions, season after season. The dominant sharks were not just bigger, they were known. Their status was established and remembered. Great whites also show what researchers call parallel feeding, where two or more sharks are feeding at the same carcass simultaneously while maintaining minimum distance from each other. They alternate passes. They do not crowd the same feeding position. The spacing looks almost choreographed, and it likely is, in the sense that both animals are following a shared behavioural protocol that reduces the risk of accidental contact during feeding. When that protocol breaks down, when a younger or more impulsive shark moves into the wrong position, the response from the dominant animal can be sudden and serious. Bite scars on great whites are common, and many of them are in locations that match exactly where another shark's teeth would land during an aggressive redirect. These are not prey interactions, they are social enforcement. The existence of this hierarchy raised an immediate question for researchers. If great whites have complex social behaviour at feeding sites, they must be communicating something. And the way they communicate turned out to be even more intricate than the hierarchy itself. Great whites do not vocalize. No clicks, no calls, no frequencies passing through the water from one shark to another, the way dolphins and whales use sound. For a long time, this absence of sound was taken as evidence of a simple inner life. Silent animal, simple animal. The logic was flawed, and the communication system researchers eventually documented is built entirely on the body. Posture is the primary channel. The arched back and downward angled pectoral fins we covered in the hierarchy chapter are part of a larger vocabulary. Researchers cataloguing great white body language at feeding sites identified at least 6 distinct postures that reliably produced predictable responses from nearby sharks. These were repeatable across different individual animals, which means they function as a shared signal system, something learned or inherited rather than individual quirk. The threat gape, an open mouth held without movement, is one of the clearest signals. It communicates dominance and willingness to escalate. A great white that gapes toward another shark is delivering a message. The receiving shark, almost without exception in documented observations, changes course. The signal works across species too. Scalloped hammerhead sharks feeding near great whites at the same carcass have been documented responding to great white threat gapes by withdrawing rapidly. Body roll is another signal. A great white rolling slightly onto its side while approaching another shark, exposing the white belly, is performing a submissive display. The rolling exposes the softer ventral surface, which in threat logic means vulnerability. Dominant sharks at feeding sites use an erect, level posture. Subordinate sharks entering the feeding area often exhibit a slight roll that seems to communicate non-aggression. Speed modulation is subtler but equally documented. A great white approaching another shark at a slow, deliberate pace signals confident dominance. A fast approach from the same direction signals aggression or challenge. A curved approach, arcing in rather than approaching in a straight line, signals lower threat intent. Researchers spent years mapping these approach curves at feeding sites and found that the geometry of approach predicted the outcome of the interaction with striking accuracy. Even more surprising is the response of great whites to diver behavior that accidentally mimics these signals. A diver who descends slowly, maintains an upright posture, and moves in steady, curving arcs produces a body language that resembles confident, non-aggressive shark behavior. Researchers and experienced divers have consistently noted that this approach style, even in close encounters, produces calmer responses from great whites than the erratic, linear retreating motion most untrained people perform when frightened. The fish's eye view of a panicking diver, limbs moving in every direction, body orientation constantly changing, speed alternating between frozen and frantic, translates in great white body language as something unstable and unpredictable. Unpredictable, in great white social terms, is a reason to escalate. The body language system of great whites operates in total silence. No sound, no scent at short range, pure visual signal carried through physical form, and that system is ancient, far older than the modern great white, far older than the oceans those first prey animals swam in. And as that system escalated through millions of years, so did the shark itself. Great white attacks do not spread evenly across the calendar. They cluster, and the clustering is precise enough that researchers can predict the high-risk windows with reasonable accuracy months in advance. In California, attacks peak between September and November. In South Africa, the highest activity window runs from May through August. In Australia, late summer into early autumn consistently produces more incidents than any other stretch of year. Each of these windows lines up with something specific happening in the biology of both the sharks and their prey, and the overlap between those two biological events is what drives the spike. The first driver is prey availability. Seal pup season produces an enormous surge of inexperienced, slow, easily targeted young seals entering the water for the first time. Great whites near seal colonies time their arrival to coincide with this surge. Pups are calorie-dense and far easier to catch than adult seals. A great white feeding on pups is in active hunting mode, tuned to surface activity and responding to stimuli with a lower threshold than it would during leaner periods. A great white in the middle of a productive pup season is processing more prey signals per hour than it would at any other time of year. Its stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline equivalents cycle up and down repeatedly through each day of active hunting. That repeated cycling keeps the shark's arousal baseline elevated even during resting periods. A shark that has made 3 successful strikes before noon is a fundamentally different behavioral animal than the same shark in February with nothing to hunt. The second driver is water temperature. Warmer water raises a great white's metabolic rate. Higher metabolism means higher caloric need. Higher caloric need means more active hunting, longer daily activity windows, and less tolerance for missed opportunities. Warm water, great whites are hungrier, faster, and less likely to disengage from a potential prey encounter before gathering all available information. The temperature shift of a few degrees changes the animal's behavioral profile measurably. Human beach use overlaps almost perfectly with both of these windows. Summer and early autumn are peak beach seasons everywhere that great whites are common. More people in the water. During the same months, the sharks are most active and most aggressive, near coastlines that also serve as seal colony habitat. The 3 factors stack, and the risk profile rises with them. Researchers have tried using these patterns to develop predictive alert systems. In California and Australia, water temperature data, seal movement tracking, and tagged shark location data are now combined into risk models that can flag elevated risk windows for specific beaches. The models are imperfect. Great whites are not completely predictable. but the seasonal patterns are real enough that early warning systems built on them have measurably improved response times for beach management teams. What makes the seasonal spike even sharper is something happening inside the shark's hormonal system that goes beyond simple temperature and hunger effects. There is a reproductive component layered into the aggression cycle, particularly in mature males, that researchers only recently began to untangle. Mature male great whites show elevated testosterone during the same windows that also produce the aggression spikes. Testosterone in sharks, as in many vertebrates, correlates with increased territorial behavior, reduced tolerance for other animals in close proximity, and faster escalation of investigative contacts into aggressive ones. A male great white in reproductive condition, feeding in a productive area, near the peak of warm water season, is simultaneously running high on 3 separate biochemical systems that all push in the same direction. And what the water temperature does to a great white at the hour-by-hour level goes far deeper than just metabolism. Drop the water temperature by 10 degrees, and you change the shark. Great whites are endothermic in a limited way. They can heat their muscles and brain above the surrounding water temperature using a circulatory system that recycles body heat before it escapes. But this system has limits. In cold water, it works harder. In very cold water, the gap between shark body temperature and water temperature narrows, and the shark's performance drops with it. Researchers tracking great whites through seasonal temperature changes documented response time differences that were significant enough to affect hunting success. In water below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, great whites moved more slowly between locations, responded to prey signals at shorter distances, and made fewer hunting passes per day than the same sharks in water above 60 degrees. Cold water was not just uncomfortable for them, it changed their capability profile. The warm water effect runs the other direction hard. A great white moving from 55-degree offshore water into a 68-degree nearshore zone, which happens along California coastlines during late summer when warm water pushes toward shore, experiences a rapid performance upgrade. Muscle response times accelerate, swimming speed increases, the sensory processing speed of the brain itself increases because neural signals travel faster at higher temperatures. Scientists studying great white brain tissue confirm this. Neural transmission speed in shark nervous tissue is temperature dependent. A warmer brain is a faster brain, processing incoming sensory data more quickly and generating motor responses with shorter lag times. A great white in warm water reacts faster to stimuli than the same shark in cold water. This has a specific and disturbing implication for human encounters. The same beaches that attract the most summer swimmers are the beaches experiencing the highest water temperatures. The water is warm because of the same seasonal dynamics that are driving shark activity higher. Swimmers are entering the water during the precise window when great whites in that zone are running at their biological peak. Faster reaction times, higher sensory sensitivity, lower threshold for pursuit decisions. The transition zones, where cold and warm water meet, are particularly active hunting areas for great whites. These thermal boundaries, called thermoclines, concentrate fish because different species prefer different temperature ranges, and prey fish aggregate on either side of the boundary. A great white moving along a thermocline is moving through a buffet. Researchers tracking feeding events relative to water temperature found a striking concentration of successful hunts within a few hundred feet of thermocline boundaries. For surfers and swimmers, thermoclines are invisible. You cannot see or feel the transition in most cases while at the surface. But from below, where a great white is hunting, the boundary is a navigational landmark. A shark working a thermocline is moving along a consistent path that intersects with the same surface zones repeatedly. Beach areas where thermoclines approach shore consistently see higher shark activity, and that activity does not require any particular behavior from the humans at the surface to explain it. The physics of the water is drawing the shark to those coordinates. There is one great white behavior that cold water does seem to unlock rather than suppress, and the track data for it changed what scientists thought they knew about where great whites actually go. In 2003, a research team tagged a female great white off the coast of South Africa and watched the tracking data come in. For weeks, the shark moved predictably along the coastline, doing what great whites were supposed to do. Then, something changed. The shark turned away from the coast and started heading into open ocean. Researchers assumed it was making a migration, which is documented behaviour, but the depth reading started to do something unexpected. The shark dove and kept diving, past 100 feet, past 500, past 1,000. It levelled off at around 3,000 feet and then it stayed there, for hours. Researchers stared at the data and had no immediate explanation. 3,000 feet below the surface is a different world. No sunlight reaches there. Water temperature drops toward freezing. Pressure at that depth is nearly 100 times what you feel at the surface. Almost nothing hunts there by sight because there is no light to hunt by. A great white, designed as a surface and mid-water predator, had apparently chosen to spend extended time in conditions where its primary advantages seem nearly irrelevant. Since that first tracking event, multiple great whites have been documented making similar deep dives. The behaviour appears most common during open ocean migrations, particularly during the crossing of deep ocean basins. Researchers have proposed several explanations. One is thermoregulation. Cold deep water, when alternated with returns to the surface, may help the shark manage internal temperature in a way that improves long-distance travel efficiency. Another explanation is navigation. The magnetic field signatures at depth may provide cleaner directional information than the noise-filled surface. A third explanation, the one that disturbs researchers the most, is that the sharks are hunting something down there. The deep ocean is full of life, most of it poorly documented. Giant squid live at those depths. Large bioluminescent fish cruise through the dark in schools. Several species of deep-water sharks share that zone. A great white that has learned to hunt at depth would have access to prey populations almost entirely undisturbed by predation pressure. It would be hunting in a zone with almost no competition. One dataset hints that this last explanation might be partially correct. Several deep-diving great whites showed significant lateral movement at depth, meaning they were not simply sinking straight down and rising straight up. They were travelling horizontally while deep, which is what a hunting animal does, not a resting one. The movements were too directed and too extended to be simple passive sinking. Something was drawing the shark sideways at 3,000 feet. What the sharks were doing down there remains an open question. No camera system deployed at those depths has successfully captured a great white in the act of deep hunting. The technology for that kind of observation barely exists. What researchers have is tracking data, depth profiles, and a growing suspicion that the great white's ecological range is dramatically larger than anyone assumed. A predator that can hunt from the surface to 3,000 feet deep is a predator that competes across a vertical column of ocean that spans almost the entire depth range of coastal and open ocean waters on Earth. But no matter how far they range in the wild, one fact about great whites has remained completely consistent across more than a century of attempts. They cannot survive captivity, and the reasons behind that failure are stranger than any escape story. Every major aquarium that has attempted to display a live great white shark has failed. The Monterey Bay Aquarium in California came closest, holding a juvenile female for 198 days in 2004 before releasing her due to declining health. That is the longest a great white has survived in captivity in recorded history. Every other attempt has ended within days to weeks. The failures are not from lack of trying or lack of resources. Monterey spent years preparing its systems. The tank they used held 1 million gallons of water. The filtration was purpose-built. The transport system for getting the shark from the ocean to the facility was engineered specifically for the challenge. And still, after about 6 months, the animal had to go back. The core problem is physiological. Great whites are obligate ram ventilators. They breathe by swimming forward, forcing water across their gills as they move. A A great white that stops moving suffocates. In a tank, constant forward movement means constant collision with walls. The sharks respond to tank boundaries by eventually turning, which interrupts the breathing rhythm, or by ramming the glass repeatedly, which causes physical injury to the snout and sensory organs. The sensory overload compounds the problem. A great white in the ocean has a sensory field that extends hundreds of feet in every direction. In a tank, even a 1,000,000-gallon one, every sensory system the shark has is being flooded with close-range signals simultaneously. The electric fields from the tank's filtration systems interact with the ampullae of Lorenzini constantly. The sounds of pumps and visitors are inescapable. The magnetic signals from metal structural elements interfere with the navigation senses. The shark cannot tune any of it out because its sensory systems have no off switch. Captive great whites consistently stop eating within days to weeks. Researchers observing captive animals document rapid weight loss, erratic swimming patterns, and increasingly frequent ram and turn impacts with tank boundaries. The fish is experiencing something that looks, behaviourally, like severe psychological stress. Whether that translates to subjective suffering is a question marine biologists approach carefully. But the behavioural signals are unambiguous. The animal is in distress that compounds over time rather than resolving. What makes this especially striking is that other large, complex shark species handle captivity much better. Bull sharks, tiger sharks, and sand tiger sharks have all been maintained successfully in aquariums for years. The great white's specific failure in captivity points to something unique in its biology or cognitive architecture, possibly the sheer scale of its sensory range, which makes any enclosed space unbearable. Possibly the combination of obligate movement and ram ventilation that makes boundaries uniquely dangerous. Possibly something about the great white's brain that makes stimulus restriction intolerable in a way that does not apply to its relatives. The irony is that the failed captivity attempts have produced some of the best close observation data on great white physiology that researchers have. Monitoring a captive animal, even briefly, gives access to blood samples, behavioural recording, and physical measurements that are nearly impossible to gather in the wild. Some of what researchers know about great white stress hormones, healing rates, and sensory sensitivity came directly from the failed aquarium attempts. What they found about how great whites handle pain during those observations was one of the more unexpected results in the field. Great whites heal wounds that would kill most animals, deep lacerations from prey, bite wounds from other sharks, hook injuries from accidental capture. Researchers photographing the same individual great whites over multiple years have documented wounds appearing and closing between visits, sometimes in time frames that seem almost impossible given the size of the initial injury. One male great white studied off the coast of South Africa was photographed with a wound near his dorsal fin large enough to fit a hand inside. When the same shark was photographed 11 weeks later, the wound had closed to a shallow scar. No infection visible, no signs of systemic illness. The healing had progressed at a rate that would require significant biological explanation in a mammal and is still not fully understood in sharks. Part of the explanation involves their blood. Great white blood clots rapidly and efficiently. The components of shark blood that trigger clotting are proportionally higher than in mammalian blood, and they activate faster in response to injury. A great white bleeding from a wound begins the sealing process almost immediately, reducing blood loss in a way that keeps the animal functional through injuries that would cause dangerous hemorrhage in humans. But the healing speed goes beyond clotting. Shark tissue, including muscle and cartilage, contains compounds that have strong antimicrobial properties. The ocean is full of bacteria that would infect open wounds in almost any other animal. Great whites expose their wounds to that bacterial environment constantly during normal hunting and social interactions. The antimicrobial properties of their tissue appear to suppress infection at the wound site during the healing process, allowing the body to close the injury without the systemic infection response that would slow recovery in a mammal. The pain question is genuinely complex. Sharks have pain-sensing nerve cells called nociceptors, but the concentration and distribution of those cells differs significantly from mammals. Researchers studying captive shark behaviour after injury found that sharks with significant wounds continued normal behavioural patterns, including feeding, without the movement restriction or behavioural changes that pain produces in mammals. Either the pain processing is different enough that it does not produce the same behavioural inhibition, or the behavioural inhibition system itself does not exist in the same form. What this means practically is a great white that is injured during a hunt or social conflict does not necessarily stop functioning. It heals while continuing to operate. And a great white that is wounded in an encounter with a human, say, by a diver defending themselves with a punch or a strike, does not necessarily respond by withdrawing in pain. It responds based on the sensory assessment of whether the encounter is worth continuing. Pain, in the way mammals experience it as a reason to retreat, may simply not be the overriding signal in a great white's nervous system. The antimicrobial properties of shark tissue have attracted serious research attention from the medical field. Compounds isolated from shark tissue have shown effectiveness against bacteria that are resistant to standard antibiotics. The mechanism behind shark wound resistance could inform treatments for antibiotic-resistant infections in humans. Several research programs are actively working on extracting and synthesizing these compounds outside of the shark's body. The immune system that supports this healing is built for an environment where injury is routine, and when researchers looked at the full architecture of that immune system, they found something that seemed almost engineered for survival. A great white's immune system is old, evolutionarily old. Sharks have been on Earth for roughly 450 million years, which means their immune architecture predates almost everything we think of as complex animal life. Dinosaurs came and went. Ice ages reshaped the planet. The great white's immune fundamentals remained largely unchanged. That kind of evolutionary stability is rare, and it tells researchers something important. This system works. The great white immune system has both fast and slow response components. The fast component, called the innate immune system, is the first line of defense when something foreign enters the body. It responds immediately to bacterial, viral, or parasitic intrusion, deploying chemical signals that trigger inflammation and cell death around the infection site. In great whites, this fast response is unusually aggressive, clearing many common bacterial threats before they can establish a foothold. The slower component, called the adaptive immune system, produces targeted antibodies for specific threats. Scientists studying great white blood found that their adaptive immune response generates antibodies with a structure slightly different from mammalian antibodies. Shark antibodies are smaller and simpler in some ways, but also more stable under extreme temperature and chemical conditions. Shark antibodies function effectively in environments that would denature mammal antibodies entirely, including high salt concentrations and wide temperature swings. This stability has enormous practical value. Researchers discovered that a category of shark antibodies, called immunoglobulin neoantigen receptors, could be used as molecular tools in medical research. Their small size and stability allows them to access protein structures that conventional antibodies cannot reach. They are currently being studied as potential cancer treatment vehicles, capable of carrying therapeutic compounds to tumour cells in ways that larger antibodies physically cannot manage. The parasite load of wild great whites is also unexpectedly low, given that they share water with high concentrations of parasitic organisms. Most large marine animals carry significant parasite loads, flukes and worms and external parasites that are considered a normal part of their biology. Great whites show significantly lower parasite counts than comparable marine animals. Whether this is due to immune function specifically, or to behavioural factors like the speed and depth of their movements, is still being investigated. What researchers do know is that the great white's immune system is robust enough to sustain an animal that regularly experiences large wounds in a bacteria-rich environment while maintaining normal function. The system keeps pace with the demands of the animal's ecological role, which is the role of a large active predator that regularly engages in dangerous behaviour to eat. The compounds in shark tissue, including immune-related proteins, anticoagulants, and antimicrobial peptides, have attracted attention from pharmaceutical researchers for decades. The challenge has been accessing these compounds without harming live animals, since great white harvesting is illegal across most of the world due to conservation status. That conservation status reflects a crisis most people have not heard about, because the animal's reputation has overshadowed its vulnerability. And the vulnerability is real, accelerating, and connected to choices happening far from the ocean. For most of the 20th century, great whites were primarily documented in specific offshore zones near known prey aggregations. Seal colonies, rocky offshore islands, certain continental shelf edges. Encounters with great whites in shallow nearshore waters, inside bays, or close to urban beaches were unusual enough to generate significant news coverage. That geographic pattern has shifted, noticeably. Researchers tracking great white movements along the California coast documented a clear trend beginning around 2010. Sharks that historically spent the majority of their time in offshore zones began spending more time within a mile of shore, in shallower water, closer to populated beaches than at any point in the previous decades of monitoring. The same pattern showed up in South Africa and parts of Australia within a few years. The first explanation researchers tested was prey. Where are the seals going? Seal populations along the California coast increased significantly after legal protections took effect in the 1970s and continued growing through the following decades. As seal populations expanded, the animals moved into new habitats, including nearshore kelp forests and shallow rocky areas closer to urban beaches. Great whites followed their food source. The sharks were not seeking humans, they were tracking seals into shallower water. The second explanation involves water temperature. Warming ocean temperatures have shifted the range of many marine species, including the fish that seals eat, the seals themselves, and the great whites that hunt them. Areas that were previously too warm or too cold for productive great white hunting have entered the optimal range. Coastlines that rarely saw great white presence 50 years ago now see regular documented encounters. A third factor is noise. Open ocean areas increasingly filled with shipping traffic, military sonar activity, and commercial fishing noise have become less navigable for great whites, which rely heavily on acoustic signals for hunting and navigation. Nearshore areas, while noisy in their own ways, offer a different acoustic environment that some researchers believe great whites find more workable for hunting. The sharks may be getting pushed towards shore, partly by the noise filling their traditional offshore territories. The combination of these forces means that the zones where humans and great whites overlap have expanded. Great whites are spending more time in areas where people swim, surf, and dive than they did a generation ago. The increase in documented encounters is partly a consequence of that geographic shift, and only partly a consequence of improved reporting and observation technology. This nearshore shift creates a feedback loop. More encounters mean more news coverage. More news coverage means more public fear. More public fear generates pressure for culling programs. Culling programs remove individual sharks from a population that is already under severe pressure. And the population pressure on great whites is a crisis that most people have never seen framed accurately. The noise piece goes deeper than just pushing sharks around. It is actively disrupting something fundamental to how they navigate. The ocean is the loudest it has ever been in human history. Commercial shipping lanes carry thousands of vessels per day across major ocean basins, each one producing continuous low-frequency engine noise that travels hundreds of miles through water. Military sonar operations generate powerful pulses that can be detected by marine animals thousands of miles from the source. Offshore drilling and construction operations add continuous mechanical noise to ocean zones that were previously among the quietest on Earth. Great whites navigate partly by reading acoustic signals in the water. Their lateral line system detects pressure waves. Their inner ear detects sound. Their ampullae of Lorenzini pick up electrical field variations that moving water and magnetic field gradients produce. All three of these systems can be disrupted by artificial noise and electromagnetic interference. The most direct effect researchers have documented is masking. When background noise levels rise, animals that rely on acoustic signals to detect prey, navigate, or communicate experience a reduction in effective range. A great white whose lateral line can normally detect a struggling fish from 300 feet away in quiet water may only detect the same signal from 100 feet away in a noisy shipping lane. The system is functional but compressed. The shark's effective sensory range shrinks. Magnetic navigation faces a different problem. Large metal ships passing through an area distort the local magnetic field. Underwater electrical infrastructure, including cables connecting offshore platforms and wind farms, produces continuous electrical fields that interact with the shark's electroreception system. A great white attempting to navigate by reading the Earth's magnetic gradient through an area crossed by multiple submarine cables is trying to read a compass in a room full of magnets. The signal is there, but it is buried in noise. Researchers studying great white movement patterns in areas with high shipping traffic documented path changes that suggest the sharks were avoiding certain zones actively. The sharks were not simply moving through these areas on different schedules. They were routing around them, adding distance to their migrations, choosing less efficient paths to avoid noise-saturated corridors. The navigation tax is real. A great white rerouting its migration to avoid shipping noise expends more energy per mile travelled, arrives at seasonal feeding grounds later, and may miss critical windows of prey availability. The downstream effects compound. A great white that arrives late to a seal colony pup season finds fewer pups available. Fewer pups mean less successful hunting. Less successful hunting means the shark carries lower energy reserves into its offshore migration. Lower reserves going into migration reduce survival odds across the crossing. Researchers have started using acoustic monitoring buoys to map noise pollution gradients in known great white corridors. The maps show something straightforward and depressing. The busier shipping lanes overlap almost perfectly with the known migration routes of great whites between their California feeding grounds and their open ocean destinations. The animals are navigating through a wall of noise every year, during a migration they have likely been making in roughly the same form for millions of years. The ocean has changed around them faster than evolution can respond to. And the population absorbing all of these pressures is far smaller than most people realize. Most people, when they think about endangered animals, picture elephants or rhinos or snow leopards. The great white shark does not fit the cultural image of a vulnerable species. It is large, it is powerful, and it occupies a dominant position in its ecosystem. None of that protects it from population collapse, and the data on great white numbers is alarming in ways the public conversation almost never reflects. Estimating great white population size is extraordinarily difficult. These are wide-ranging, deep-diving, individually variable animals that spend large amounts of time in open ocean far from monitoring infrastructure. The best population estimates use photo identification, genetic sampling, and mark recapture methods at known aggregation sites. Those estimates are wide-ranging and carry large uncertainty bands. What researchers do agree on is direction. Population trends for great whites across their global range have been declining for decades. In the North Pacific, off the California coast, population estimates from the best available photo identification databases suggest a few hundred to perhaps a few thousand animals remain. A survey published in 2021 used environmental genetics, extracting shark genetic material from ocean water samples, and arrived at numbers on the lower end of previous estimates. The California great white population is believed to be small enough that losing 50 animals to any single cause would represent a meaningful fraction of the total. Historically, great whites were harvested directly for sport fishing, trophy hunting, and for their jaws, teeth, and fins. Jaw sets of large great whites sold for tens of thousands of dollars in trophy markets. This direct harvest removed significant numbers before protections were established, and most protections only arrived in the 1990s, meaning decades of unregulated hunting preceded them. Bycatch is the continuing problem. Great whites are not commercially targeted, but they are caught incidentally in longline fishing operations targeting tuna, swordfish, and other high-value species. A great white that swims into a longline and cannot free itself drowns. The number of great whites dying in bycatch annually across all ocean basins is estimated to be in the hundreds. For a population already under stress, hundreds of animals per year is a serious ongoing loss. Finning, the practice of cutting shark fins for shark fin soup and discarding the body, affects great whites despite legal protections because enforcement in international waters is nearly impossible. The fin of a large great white is worth significant money, and the body is too large to transport whole on most fishing vessels, making the incentive structure for illegal finning difficult to counteract. The pace of population recovery for great whites, even under ideal protection conditions, is slow. Great whites reach sexual maturity late, between 9 and 14 years of age. Females produce small litters, between 2 and 10 pups per pregnancy, after a gestation period believed to last around a year. These life history traits mean the species cannot rapidly replace losses the way faster reproducing fish can. A population that drops too far cannot bounce back on a human-relevant timescale. But the problem is even bigger than individual survival numbers. Remove the great white from its ecosystem and something fundamental breaks. And what breaks is not subtle. Pull one brick from the wrong place and the wall comes down. Ecologists use the term keystone species to describe animals that hold a disproportionate amount of the ecosystem together relative to their own population size. Remove them, and the system does not simply lose one component. It reorganizes in ways that cascade through every level. Great whites are a keystone predator in every ecosystem they inhabit. Their influence extends far beyond the animals they directly hunt. The effects ripple outward through behavior, population structure, and habitat use patterns in ways that researchers have only recently begun to map with any precision. The most direct effect is on seal and sea lion populations. Great whites are the primary apex predator controlling seal numbers in many coastal ecosystems. Without that predation pressure, seal populations grow beyond the carrying capacity of their habitat. Larger seal populations consume more fish. More fish consumption by seals means less fish available for the smaller predators, including dolphins, seabirds, and commercially important fish species that depend on the same resource. In places where shark populations collapsed, researchers observed the predicted chain reaction. A study tracking marine ecosystem changes in areas with historically reduced shark populations found measurable increases in seal numbers, followed by measurable reductions in the mid-level fish species the seals consumed, followed by disruptions to the fish species below those, moving downward through the food web like a slow collapse through a series of flaws. Great whites also influence ecosystem structure through what ecologists call the landscape of fear. Even in areas where great whites are not actively hunting, their potential presence changes how other animals move and use space. Seals in areas with active great white presence avoid certain zones, use certain entry and exit points in water, and cluster in larger groups that limit individual risk. These behavioural changes alter how the seals interact with the fish and kelp they depend on. Remove the great white, and seals lose their vigilance. They spread out. They use more of the available habitat. They feed in areas they previously avoided. The reach of their grazing effect on fish populations expands. Marine protected areas that successfully harbour great white populations are measurably more productive, with more complex food web dynamics, than comparable areas without apex predators. The ocean floor is also affected. Whale falls, the sinking of dead whale carcasses to the seafloor, are major nutrient events for deep ocean ecosystems. Great whites are among the primary scavengers of large whale carcasses at the surface, consuming and distributing the nutrients before the carcass sinks. Fewer great whites means fewer animals efficiently processing whale carcasses at the surface, which changes the nutrient distribution pattern. Climate change is adding pressure to every part of this system simultaneously. Warming water shifts prey distributions. Ocean acidification affects the small organisms at the base of the food web. Fishing pressure on mid-level species compresses the food web from below, while apex predator loss compresses it from above. A system that loses its apex predator while facing those additional pressures from multiple directions simultaneously is a system in serious trouble. The great white holds the structure together, but even the great white has a predator, and what that predator does to great whites is one of the most precise and disturbing hunting strategies documented in the ocean. In the mid-1990s, researchers at the Farallon Islands off the California coast watched something happen that rewrote what they thought they knew about the ocean's power structure. A pair of orcas, also called killer whales, arrived near a known great white feeding area. Within 2 hours, every tagged great white in the monitoring area had left. The animals that dominated this ecosystem, animals that fear almost nothing in the ocean, fled from 2 orcas. Then the orcas killed 1. Orcas are the apex predator of the ocean, full stop. They are bigger than great whites on average. They are faster. They hunt in coordinated social groups. They communicate in real time during hunts. They pass hunting techniques between generations as learned culture, and they have figured out a specific, efficient method for killing great white sharks. The method exploits great white physiology directly. When a great white is flipped upside down, it enters a state called tonic immobility. Tonic immobility is a paralysis response that occurs when certain pressure points on the underside of the shark are stimulated. The shark goes completely rigid and still. It stops breathing. It cannot right itself. The state can last for up to 15 minutes, and during that time the shark is defenseless. Orcas have been documented intentionally flipping great whites upside down and holding them in that position. The technique appears learned and deliberately applied. The orca approaches the shark, forces it into an inverted position, and maintains that position while the shark suffocates. When the shark is dead or near death, the orca feeds on the liver, which is the most calorie-dense organ in the shark's body. A great white liver can weigh hundreds of pounds. It is so rich in energy-dense oils and fats that it represents a single feeding event equivalent to many smaller hunts. Researchers following specific orca pods documented individual animals developing reputations for shark hunting. 2 female orcas in South African waters, tracked over multiple years, became known for their efficiency at targeting great whites specifically. They appeared to coordinate approaches, with one animal positioning to cut off escape routes while the other made the initial contact to flip the shark. The knowledge is transmitted. Young orcas in pods with experienced shark hunters have been observed watching and accompanying adults during great white predation events. The technique is being passed down as cultural knowledge, the same way human hunters teach skills to the next generation. The consequence for great white populations in areas with active orca hunting is measurable. After significant orca predation events at South African feeding sites, great white numbers at those sites dropped noticeably in subsequent seasons. The sharks were not simply scared away temporarily. The persistent association of certain locations with orca activity appeared to shift great white site use patterns over years. What happens to great whites when orcas show up is a behavioural response so extreme it has changed how researchers understand the shark's ecological flexibility. When orcas enter an area where great whites are feeding, the great whites leave, every time. The response is not occasional, it is not variable. Across every documented case researchers have collected from California to South Africa to New Zealand, the outcome is the same. Great whites detect orca presence and abandon the area within hours. The abandonment is not a short-term retreat either. Tagged great whites have been tracked leaving feeding sites after orca encounters and staying away for months, sometimes for the remainder of the entire season. A great white that has spent years returning to the same seal colony, timing its migrations to arrive at the same productive window, will give up that location entirely and not return until the following year, if at all. How do great whites detect orcas? Multiple systems are likely involved. Orcas are loud animals. Their echolocation clicks and social calls carry long distances through water. A great white's acoustic sensing system picks up these sounds well before any visual contact is possible. Orca chemical signatures in the water are also distinctive, and great white olfactory systems are tuned broadly enough to detect them. There is some evidence that great whites respond to orca sounds, played through an underwater speaker, even in the absence of any actual orcas. The response to orca acoustic signals appears to be hardwired, rather than learned from experience. Juvenile great whites with no documented orca encounters still show avoidance behaviour when exposed to orca sounds. The fear of orcas seems to be built into the shark's biology, rather than acquired through direct negative experience. Researchers tracking the ecological downstream effects of orca presence found something unexpected. When great whites abandoned their usual seal colony feeding areas after orca encounters, the seal population at those sites experienced a measurable and rapid change in behaviour. Seals that had been vigilant, clustered and cautious immediately expanded their use of the habitat. They entered the water more freely. They spread out along the shoreline in ways they had avoided during the period of active shark predation. The absence of the great white restructured the behaviour of every other animal in the system almost instantly. In California, the years following significant orca activity near the Farallon Islands saw a measurable drop in great white presence there, and a corresponding increase in great white sightings along other parts of the coast, suggesting the displaced sharks were redistributing along the coastline looking for alternative feeding sites. Some of those alternative sites were closer to populated beaches than the offshore islands the sharks had traditionally used. The displacement effect connects directly back to the nearshore shift discussed earlier. Orca pressure on traditional offshore feeding areas is one factor, among several, pushing great whites into new locations. The sharks are not choosing to spend more time near humans. They are being squeezed out of their established zones by multiple pressures simultaneously, and the coast is where they end up. And yet, despite everything pushing against them, great whites keep moving. They migrate, they navigate, they time their movements to something so distant and so constant that it took researchers years to see the connection clearly. Great whites are migratory animals. They travel thousands of miles between feeding grounds and open ocean resting areas on a schedule that is, when tracked across multiple years and multiple individuals, remarkably consistent. Researchers expected the schedule to follow water temperature and prey availability, the obvious biological drivers, and it does follow those things, roughly. But layered underneath the big seasonal patterns, there is a finer-grained timing mechanism that researchers have been piecing together over the last 2 decades. Lunar cycles affect great white feeding behaviour in measurable ways. The connection is not mystical, it is mechanical. The moon drives tides, and tides drive fish movement. Fish that spawn, migrate or feed in relation to tidal cycles are more concentrated, more predictable, and more accessible to predators at specific lunar phases. A new moon produces larger tidal swings than a quarter moon. Larger tidal swings move more water, which concentrates prey in channels and near reef edges with greater force. Researchers studying great white feeding events at multiple sites found a statistical pattern. Feeding activity was measurably higher during full and new moon phases, when tidal forces are strongest, than during quarter moon phases. The difference was not overwhelming, but it was consistent enough across sites and years to qualify as a real behavioural signal. Night feeding adds another dimension. Great whites are documented as active hunters at night, and their vision is well adapted to low-light conditions. A full moon provides significant surface illumination, which from underwater creates a bright lit surface through which silhouettes are easier to see. Seal silhouettes at the surface on a full moon night are more visible to a great white hunting from below than the same silhouettes on a moonless night. Some researchers have proposed that the moon's effect on visibility, rather than just tides, drives part of the feeding pattern. The open ocean migration timing also appears to have lunar components. great whites undertaking the long crossing between California coastal waters and the mid-Pacific Congregation Zone, an area researchers call the White Shark Cafe, tend to depart within specific lunar windows. Whether this reflects navigation using the moon directly, or whether it reflects conditions created by lunar cycles that make the migration more efficient, is still being studied. The White Shark Cafe itself is one of the stranger discoveries in great white research. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between the California coast and Hawaii, great whites from both California and Hawaii congregate every year. The area appears largely featureless to human eyes. No obvious prey concentration, no thermal feature, no magnetic anomaly that researchers have been able to identify as a strong explanatory factor. Yet the sharks arrive there every year at roughly the same time from opposite sides of the ocean. What they do there for the months they spend in the area has generated competing explanations, including reproduction, deep water hunting, and social behaviour. The truth may involve all three, and the ability to navigate to that precise point in the middle of a featureless ocean year after year across thousands of miles points back to a navigational system that was built long before modern great whites existed. The ancient roots of that system and the animal it created make the modern great white look almost restrained by comparison. The great white shark's ancestors were swimming in Earth's oceans before the dinosaurs appeared. Sharks as a group have been around for roughly 450 million years, making them one of the oldest vertebrate lineages on the planet. They predate trees, they predate insects with wings, they predate almost every animal a person could name from everyday life. And through all of that time, the basic design held up well enough that it was never fundamentally discarded. The great white as we know it today is a relatively recent iteration, appearing in the fossil record around 3 million years ago. Before it, a lineage of similar large sharks existed for tens of millions of years, and the evolutionary relationship between those earlier forms and the modern great white is still an active area of debate among researchers. The animal most often mentioned in connection with great whites is Megalodon, a massive shark that lived from roughly 23 million to 3 million years ago. Megalodon teeth, which are the primary fossil evidence for the animal because shark skeletons are made of cartilage and rarely fossilize, are found on every continent and in almost every major ocean basin. The teeth suggest an animal potentially reaching 40 to 60 feet in length, dwarfing the largest modern great whites. The relationship between Megalodon and the modern great white was long assumed to be direct ancestry. Recent genetic and morphological analysis has complicated that picture. Many researchers now believe Megalodon belongs to a separate lineage, the Otodontids, which went extinct without giving rise to modern great whites. The modern great white appears to have evolved from a different ancestral line that was smaller and coexisted with Megalodon during part of the overlap period. If that analysis is correct, Megalodon and the great white were competitors, not parent and child. Two large apex predators sharing the same ocean, potentially competing for the same prey at certain size ranges. The extinction of Megalodon around 3 million years ago, roughly coinciding with the expansion of great white populations in the fossil record, suggests the competition may have been significant. What changed between the earliest great whites and today's animals is mostly scale and refinement, not fundamental design. The teeth serration pattern has become more efficient over time. The body proportion shifted slightly toward the high-speed pursuit form that modern great whites show. The brain, relative to body size, increased modestly, which correlates with the behavioral complexity researchers now document in living animals. The endothermy, the ability to warm muscles and brain above water temperature, appears to have developed relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Earlier shark lineages were fully cold-blooded. The warm muscle adaptation gave great whites a speed and performance advantage in cold water that opened new prey categories and new geographic ranges. It was a major evolutionary step, and it happened within a time frame that is recent by geological standards. All of this evolutionary refinement produced an animal that is, in every measurable way, extraordinarily good at what it does, and what it does is not simple. Between the major hunting events that define the species in the public mind, great whites are doing something that nobody expected when satellite tracking first revealed it. The public image of the great white is an animal perpetually hunting, circling and threatening, a machine that only knows aggression. Satellite tracking data has produced a completely different picture. Between the seal colony feeding seasons, the surface attacks, and the coastal encounters that generate news, great whites spend the majority of their time doing something that looks almost like wandering, slowly, across enormous distances, with very little feeding at all. Researchers tracking the California great white population found that many animals spend several months each year in open ocean, far from any known prey concentration, moving steadily but without the directed, prey-focused movement patterns seen near feeding grounds. Some of these migrations covered more than 3,000 miles each way, crossing deep ocean basins to reach the mid-Pacific congregation zone, and then returning. During these open ocean periods, the sharks' behavior looks completely different from their coastal feeding behavior. They dive deep during the day, often to several hundred feet, and return to shallower depths at night. They swim slower than their hunting speed. Their movement paths, when plotted on a map, are far straighter than the circling investigative patterns seen near prey. They appear to be travelling with a destination, not searching. The feeding rate during these migration periods appears very low. Stomach content analysis on great whites caught in bycatch during open ocean crossings, combined with bioenergetic modelling from tracking data, suggests that many animals are running primarily on stored energy during migrations rather than actively hunting. A large great white can carry enough fat reserves, concentrated in the liver, to sustain a months-long crossing with minimal active feeding. The liver is not just an immune organ, it is a fuel tank. At the mid-Pacific congregation site, the behaviour changes again. Researchers deploying archival tags that record depth and light levels found that the sharks at the congregation zone make very different dive patterns than the straight-line migration dives. They make repeated dives to specific depths, returning to the surface and diving again in patterns that suggest active investigation of a depth zone. The movement is exploratory, not migratory. Something is drawing their attention downward. Current thinking involves deep-water squid populations, which are highly concentrated in certain mid-ocean zones and represent a calorie-dense prey source. Others point to the possible social function of the congregation, with reproduction as a component. Female great whites are less commonly tracked to the congregation zone than males, but when they appear there, they are typically in a size and age range consistent with reproductive maturity. The social behaviour at the congregation zone remains almost completely undocumented through direct observation, because the depths and remoteness make camera deployment extremely difficult. What researchers have is tracking data that shows multiple animals occupying the same area simultaneously, which for a species presumed to be largely solitary is itself significant. An animal that crosses 3,000 miles of open ocean on stored fat, navigates to a specific unmarked point in a featureless sea, engages in unknown social behaviour with other members of its species, and then turns around and crosses back to hunt seals in California, is doing something that requires navigation, memory, timing, and decision-making of a kind that forces a re-examination of what kind of animal this actually is. And that re-examination leads directly to the hardest and most important question about the great white. The great white's reputation is built on teeth and blood. The image is ancient and simple, a killing machine, nothing more. Science spent most of the 20th century agreeing. Small brain relative to body, simple nervous system, pure instinct. That consensus has collapsed, and what replaced it changes everything about how humans need to think about these animals. Start with brain structure. Great white brains, relative to body size, fall within the range of many birds and mammals, groups not typically dismissed as simple. The cerebellum, the region handling coordination and sensoromotor integration, is proportionally large and heavily folded. More folding means more surface area, which means more processing capacity. The olfactory bulbs are massive. but the regions involved in learning, memory, and behavioural flexibility are larger than models of simple instinct animals would predict. Learning behaviour, which we covered in Chapter 9, is now well enough documented to no longer be controversial among researchers. Individual great whites show distinct hunting strategies that improve with experience. They remember locations across seasons and years. They update their responses to familiar and unfamiliar situations based on prior outcomes. These are all markers of behavioural intelligence in any species, but the evidence that pushed researchers furthest was the play behaviour. Great whites have been documented interacting with floating objects, including buoys, seaweed, and debris, in ways that serve no obvious predatory purpose. They mouth the objects, push them, return to them. In several documented cases, great whites have been observed interacting with the same object repeatedly, over periods of minutes to hours. There is no prey assessment explanation that fits. The behaviour looks like investigation and engagement for its own sake. Play behaviour, in any animal, is associated with higher cognitive function. Animals that play are engaging with the world beyond the demands of immediate survival. They are testing things, exploring. The observation of great whites doing anything resembling this forced a significant revision in how the species was categorised behaviourally. The problem is that the great white's reputation has driven policies and public attitudes that are running ahead of what science actually knows. Culling programs are based on the idea of a simple, replaceable threat that can be removed to improve safety. Conservation resistance is partly based on the assumption that protecting a predator of this kind offers little benefit beyond ecological accounting. Both of those assumptions are increasingly hard to defend given what researchers now know. A species that learns, that remembers, that navigates thousands of miles using built-in instruments we're only beginning to understand, that communicates through body language, that has a social hierarchy, that may engage in something resembling play, is a species that demands a different kind of attention than the ocean's mythology has assigned it. The great white is in trouble. Population numbers are declining. Its habitat is noisier and warmer and more disrupted than at any point in the 3 million years of its existence. Its prey base is shifting, its traditional spaces are being compressed, and it is being managed based on a version of itself that the science has already retired. What we do with that gap between the old story and the real animal is not a question for researchers alone. The ocean that holds this animal holds everything that depends on it, and that list is longer and more connected to human life than most people ever stop to consider.